resources and research online, one of my primary duties is to support scholarly communications at the university. So when faculty are looking for publication venues or navigating questions of copyright, I'll do educational work and assist them in those roles. I do also have plenty of responsibility with reference, library loan and things like that. My other big responsibility is managing the university's SOAR at USA online archive of student and faculty research. So that's kind of my role. So I'm well suited up to present on copyright. With the move to online learning under the COVID-19 crisis, we thought it would be a great opportunity to kind of present this material in a fresh light with regard to the push for online learning, highlight some of the library resources, and also give you some good tools for thinking about using copyrighted materials in education and digital instruction. So it seems a little silly to ask, but what is copyright? When I talk to people, they typically think of copyright in terms of patents and intellectual property and trademarks and things like that. There's certainly a relationship there in terms of the protections and restrictions of use, things like that. And that really is what they're getting at. They're thinking of the little expression on the front of a textbook that says all rights reserved, the protection of various uses, particularly with regard to reproduction and distribution of the work. But those controls, those that sort of restrictive permission culture around copyrighted work is what most people, rightly so, focus on. But it's good to think, particularly when it comes to our educational purposes, what the real motive behind the creation of copyright law was from a sort of societal perspective. And the real purpose of copyright is to promote creativity and advance knowledge. Science, the useful arts is the phrase that the Constitution uses when it's describing the ability of Congress to implement copyright laws. So that really comes down to securing the right to do certain things with that copyrighted work to the creator, right, or to the copyright holder if the creator has maybe transferred those rights through some sort of publication contract or something. Securing for limited times. This is essentially how long does the copyright protection last, right? Is that still in copyright? Is a common question people ask. So not only are those copyright protections typically for limited times in order to continue to create and promote advancement, those exclusive rights are very explicit. What rights are protected. Those in the legal code come down to reproduction and distribution, which are definitely appropriate to our purposes. But also when it comes to artwork or plays or movies or that kind of thing, performance, display, transmission, be that through the internet or through the broadcast airwaves, and also preparation of what are called derivative works. That's one that doesn't touch on us so much. We're more concerned with reproduction, distribution, transmission. But derivative works is really taking a copyrighted work and creating new works that are derived from that work, right? So the best example I can come up with is a new Potter novel. Even though it's not written yet, J.K. Rowling could produce another Harry Potter novel based on that storyline, based on those characters, right? That work is copyrighted. She reserves the right to prepare derivative works based on that. I cannot go out and write and publish a new Harry Potter novel because her right to preparation of that derivative work is protected under the law. Fan fiction online aside, that's typically not done for a for-profit motive, so there's some gray area with that. But that's what we mean by protection. But in terms of copying, sharing, images, files, articles, text, chapters, that reproduction and distribution is a protected right of either the creator themselves or of the copyright holder if that copyright's been transferred. So those are the things that we need to think about and what we're restricted in some sense from doing with that work. What's protected? What does it take to be a protected work? It's actually quite minimal. It does have to be an original work of authorship, creative work of some kind. That means some minimal amount of creativity has gone into it. A simple list of facts or numbers or addresses in a phone book typically isn't viewed as creative. However, a work of creative literature certainly would be. A textbook which relies heavily on facts, say a textbook of physiology, right, is really publishing a number of facts about the natural physiological world, but it's expressed in a particular form, and that textbook, that chapter, that expression is what's being copyrighted there. Which brings us to the next thing. It needs to be fixed in some tangible form of expression. So typically this is going to be documented in some sort of document, whether that's a digital file, a paper manuscript, a video recording or phonographic recording, if it's video or music. There does not need to be any requirement of notice of copyright. So it doesn't even need to say all rights reserved or have the little C stamped on it for it to be protected. Simply by virtue of being a creative work and being fixed in some form, it's already protected under copyright. So that's another misunderstanding, is that it needs to be expressed. It doesn't need to be expressed. There's no requirement of notice. It doesn't need to be registered with the Copyright Office. Typically, what will happen is people will register their work with the Copyright Office in order to establish priority, meaning in order to kind of document that they were the first one to write this thing or to create this work. You can see how if you were going into a lawsuit, simply saying, I wrote this novel first and showing a computer file isn't as strong as saying, I wrote this novel first, and here's the date that I registered it with the Copyright Office, and here's the file that I deposited with the Copyright Office. So you can see how that bolsters your case in litigation. So that registration and deposit of registered works is certainly useful, but again, not a requirement for copyright. There are certain limitations and exceptions to those protections afforded to the creator. Typically, those, for our purposes, are going to fall under education and scholarship. But library preservation is another one. If, let's say, there's a limited number of copies of a rare novel that was written in the 30s and it's no longer in print, it might still be technically within copyright in terms of the duration, but the copyright holder is long since passed. There's really no way to get permission to copy that work. You can see that might be a situation where a library duplication of that work might come into play. So preservation is definitely an exception. Any sort of criticism, parody, satire, literary criticism is another ripe area for exception under certain circumstances. We also talk about transformational use. That's more of a creative thing, I think, overall, and it's difficult to put in terms that touch on the type of work that we do with copyrighted work. But I think a good example is there was a legal case where a rapper had sampled Roy Orbison's song "Pretty Woman," but he had transformed it and sampled it and digitally modified it in a way that it was recognizable as the Pretty Woman song. But it was a whole new thing. It had been transformed to the point where it no longer served the purpose that the original piece served. and in some sense, there was no way that rap song was going to be interfering with the market of Roy Orbison's song. So that was deemed as transformational use. So it had been transformed enough to no longer be identified as the original. That kind of creative transformation is another strong exception under copyright law. But we'll obviously be concerned with the education and scholarship aspects. But even under those particular exceptions, these kind of broad zones of operation, there are very specific factors that need to be looked at and sort of weighed in a holistic balance to determine whether or not that's fair use under copyright law. That is, does it fall under exceptional uses? And there are 4 factors that are typically looked at. These are actually codified in U.S. law, and these are what any judge determining the outcome of a litigation on copyright would be looking at. The first one is the nature of the copyrighted work. So I already mentioned the idea of creativity being a key factor, right? So simple lists of facts aren't really copyrightable. Certain expressions of facts in a work that required some creative effort to put together, to assemble, to describe, to create educational benefit from those straight facts. That is more creative, even though it's not like fictional. There's creative effort put into that. So that would lean, the more of that type of effort that's put into it, the more protected that work would be. The purpose and character of the use. So not only is the purpose of the original work, the character of the original work come into play, but also how are you using it? We already mentioned those zones of exception, particularly education, satirical criticism, that kind of thing, commentary. And that if you're sort of duplicating the purpose and use of the original versus co-opting it, whether that's through transformation, like the Roy Orbison song, or in an educational environment, the use that you're putting it to is a big factor in determining whether or not that's fair use or not. Another one is the amount and substantiality of use. Very often you'll see sort of these, I call them mythical guidelines, a number that says as long as it's under 20%, it's fine. It's fair use. Or 2 chapters of a textbook, or 10%, something like that. And while those might be useful guidelines, it's really impossible, given all 4 of these factors, to say that a given percentage of a work is okay to reproduce under fair use, because different situations offer a different balance of all of these factors, right? So it's possible in that situation I described of the library preservation of the rare novel, that 100% duplication could fall under legal uses of a copyrighted work. But it's also possible that 5% could be a violation if it gets at what we call the heart of the work. If it's a substantial core of the work at hand, even a small amount could be considered a violation and not fair use. So there is no hard and fast percentage or page number account for that, but obviously the greater amount that's being used is going to lean against fair use, and the smaller amount is going to lean for, with the context of these other factors also being balanced into that. And the last one, which I think is typically quite significant, but theoretically none of these weighs more than any of the others, but I think certain situations bring one or another to the fore, and one that's brought very often to the fore is the effect on the effect of your use of that copyrighted work on the market for the original. So if you're photocopying a textbook and placing it online, there's substantial interference with the original market for that work, right? So that would definitely most likely fall under the category of violation. However, if you're doing a small snippet for illustrative purposes of maybe a snippet of an article for demonstration of critical appraisal, then that's probably not going to interfere with the publisher's use of that work. You're not using the whole, you're not duplicating it, you're putting it in a very specific context, so that's going to fit the fair use. But the more that the use that you're putting it to impinges on the market for the original work, the more problematic it's going to be and the less likely that that would fall under a fair use analysis. So, simple example, I already alluded to it somewhat. A professor wants to save money on textbooks, so they won't have to buy the textbook. The professor photocopies the most important chapters and places them on reserve in the library. So this would be physical photocopies that the students can check out of the library, right? Maybe that professor limited it to a certain number of chapters. You know, what number of chapters would be okay? As we saw, there really is no hard and fast rules. Those guidelines say 10% or 20% or 1 or 2 chapters really are oversimplifying and not taking into account the context of those other factors, right? So, however, by placing them on reserve in the library, they are certain that that professor is certainly limiting access and limiting the effect of impingement on the market for the original. They're limiting it only to students potentially in her course who have access to the library. And it is a small amount of the work, theoretically. Could still get to, in the fact that we call it the most important chapters. You could define that in such a way that really got at what we call the heart of the work, and that even though it was only a chapter or two, it was the essential chapters that were the expression of that work, and then that would not fall under fair use. So again, that full gestalt analysis of those factors is what comes into play. So instead of putting it on reserve in the library, what if they made a PDF and put it on the web? Obviously, if these are critical chapters and they're widely posted on the internet, that's going to have the potential to substantially infringe on the market, right? Anyone who needs those chapters no longer has to buy the textbook. They just have to log on to ScribeD or whatever some of those websites that really operate in these zones have. So placing it on the web, not a good idea. Placing it maybe in a course shell behind a login, a very limited access, I think carves out, again, we're sort of taking those 4 factors and identifying ways in which we can make that use operate in a more safe zone, right? So you put it behind the course shell, fewer people can access it. Maybe you label it clearly that this is copyrighted and not to be redistributed. Do not post on the web, all sorts of language that keys students into the fact that this shouldn't be shared outside of the course shell. All those things are sort of limiting the effect on the market, right? So even if we are using the most important chapters, we're doing everything that we can to limit that effect on the market. So after the internet and online learning really started to grow up in the days after the internet, the Congress felt a need to address what were kind of marginal uses of educational fair use and things, but that very clearly fell under transmission of copyrighted works, right? So anything that's shared online is transmission of a copyrighted work. However, because digital instruction was becoming a real thing, Congress had to revise the performance and display and transmission laws for the use of copyrighted work in the digital classroom. It didn't change the protections of the law. It didn't change how much or what you could share. It just sort of redefined the classroom to apply to digital transmission under very specific circumstances. So that's typically what we're operating in when we're doing online instruction. But those circumstances are very specific. That use has to be an integral part of the class experience. It can't just be tangential supplementary material that goes beyond anything that we're instructing on. And it has to be controlled by the instructor. So very often that's behind a login in a course shell. It could be a presentation within a live lecture session where the students don't necessarily have access to the file to be able to do something with it later. And it has to be analogous to a live classroom setting. So my favorite example on this is a film. Let's say you have a film class and you're required to watch, these 8 films that you're going to watch in class and critique them deeply. The professor could theoretically show those 8 films in class, and very often film classes, that's a large portion of the class is watching these films as a group and then discussing them, right? But if that professor were to put the entire Universal Studios library online and say, this is a film class and here's all this material for you to utilize, that's not remotely analogous to display in a live classroom. You really need to limit that access, limit the duration, and make reasonable measures to prevent wider distribution and wider infringement on the market. So watching a few films in class is likely analogous to a live classroom. Watching and accessing the entire Universal Studios library in perpetuity goes well beyond that. So you need to keep in mind that specific classroom experience and what that would look like and how sharing the work in a digital environment would be analogous to that. So another scenario, let's say an instructor wants to use an article from a journal and she scans the journal and posts it in the course shell. I think that's quite common. That happens quite a bit, even here. Hopefully under strict conditions, permissions, and things like that, which we'll talk about. But that's the kind of thing that we can envision pretty readily, right? It's behind the course shell. Arguably, it's the whole work because it's an entire article, right? Those things are definitely copyrighted by the publishers. They won't hesitate to let you know. But does it fall under fair use? It's for education purposes. It's limited to the extent that we're able. Potentially analogous to what might be used in a classroom. But it is the whole work, and it is kind of a wider sharing of a copyrighted piece. So if we think again about the 4 factors and how we can carve out a more friendly space, how might we define this use, circumscribe this use so that it operates more in that friendly zone? How else might you share that information? If it's an open access article, by open access I mean it's freely available on the web I should specify by the copyright holder. Very often articles like this are posted on like ResearchGate or academia.edu, these sort of scholarly social networks where you're posting your scholarly work. But very often those are publisher versions that are copyrighted and shouldn't be being released into that environment. But if it's available as open access at the publisher or by the copyright holder, you could certainly link out to that. That way you're not distributing the work, you're just providing the student with direction to get access to the work from a legitimate distributor. If it's a library resource, you might link into the library, and I'll talk a little bit about creating permanent links to library resources before we're done. Just to review a little bit, just to emphasize these particular myths. It does not require registration or some expression of protection on the document itself in order for it to be copyrighted. Just because there's no C symbol on it doesn't mean it's okay to duplicate. If it's for education, there are still a very specific set of circumstances that need to be looked at before you can deem it to be fair use. Just because it's for educational purposes doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with it under fair use. It has to come out in the balance as fair use. So again, those numbers, percentages, page numbers, chapter numbers, things like that, those are maybe useful guidelines, but really do ignore a lot of context and are inaccurate in that regard. They're well-intentioned in terms of carving out a space that ought to be safe without a lot of legal thought or analysis, but they can be dangerous if they're used a little too cursorily. So I would encourage you to take into a little bit fuller account a fuller fair use analysis, and I'll give you some tools for doing that before we're done. And again, the Teach Act, just like with the educational purposes, just because you're doing it for distance education doesn't mean that you're allowed to put anything you want online under that purpose. It has to adhere to those criteria and be looked at under the factors that we discussed. Another scenario that I think is quite common for instructors is using an image for an online lecture or an in-person lecture for that matter. Very often these images are copyrighted. Almost always they're copyrighted. The artists themselves, whether they're computer artists or graphic artists, are definitely putting creative work into that, and they deserve those protections. So let's say this professor wanted to scan an image and use it in his lecture slide, record those lectures and put them in Blackboard. This is complicated by the fact that we're a for-profit university, right? As would our situation, any of our scenarios. The fact that we're a for-profit university, it weighs under that nature of our use, and the fact that we're using it for commercial activity is going to weigh against us in every situation. Whether we still come out okay in the balance or not depends upon the rest of the context. But there's certainly potential. We're kind of swimming upstream already by virtue of the fact that we're a for-profit institution. So if he wants to scan that and put it in Blackboard, could very well be problematic, right? Very often these images are considered works of their own. So even within an article, the image itself could be deemed the whole work, because that's the work itself is the image, it's not a part of the book that it's in. It's seen as a work in itself very often. So by using it, you are essentially using 100% of it. So when it comes to the substantiality factor, that could be a big problem. There are other options out there. So instead of just pulling images willy-nilly from the web or photocopying images from textbooks, there's other options. One of which that I think is particularly useful is instructor resources. You may be familiar with these, but if you're not, it's definitely worth looking into. Many publishers have packages, materials meant for users of a particular textbook. So if you teach anatomy, there might be a package of instructor resources that include images, slide decks, and things that would be useful to someone teaching from that material, from that textbook, but would be licensed for your use. That's very often a good way to go. Again, potentially confounded by the fact that we're a for-profit institution, but they do license those for use. So consider that option. There's also the ability to sort through images online to define, to locate either rights-free or permissioned, licensed, permissive uses of particular images. So I'll do some demonstration of that before we're done here. I'll do that now. So one of the things that is particularly useful, if you're searching Google and let's do images, images.google.com, you can search for, let's say, brain anatomy. You may or may not be familiar with this, but I want to promote it anyway. Once you've got your list of images in Google Images, there's a Tools button here, and if you click on that, you can see usage rights appear here. You can select things that are labeled for reuse, for non-commercial reuse, labeled for reuse modification, meaning you could adapt that image in some way. But by specifying one of those, you limit your resources to ones that Google at least has identified as having potential for reuse. Now, you have to be very careful doing this because just because they make it through that filter doesn't mean that they're not still copyrighted. So let's just take this for example. You'll look here, it does have a thing that says images may be subject to copyright. Typically, if you'll go all the way into the image itself, you'll find a page like this, and there may be some expression of copyright. So here in this is Wikipedia. It shows that this is in the public domain because it was published prior to 1925. So that image you could grab and use in a course without any danger of copyright. But just because it makes it through the filter, do your due diligence, go in and look closely at the page where the image appears and look for some sort of permissive language. That could either be Creative Commons rights usage or some statement that it's in the public domain. If you get that permissive usage, then you could still adapt it for your course. Just because it doesn't say that it's protected, again, remember what we said about not needing to be marked as protected in order to still be protected under copyright. So if you find an image here, go in and you look closely and you don't see any language, the safer assumption is that it does continue to be under copyright. Only if you see some sort of permissive language would I encourage you to use that. The other option is Creative Commons, and that's actually where I got the image that I threw in mind. So under Creative Commons, this is an organization that sort of created some legal licenses that allow authors and creators to give advance permission of how that work can be used. So instead of saying all rights reserved, I can label a work that says Creative Commons non-commercial, which means I'm happy to let you, I'm sort of giving pre-permission to let you utilize that work as long as you're not doing it for commercial purposes. Or another common one is Creative Commons attribution. You can use that work as long as you link back to the original and credit me. Then you can distribute it. You can use it however you like. Just make sure you attribute it to me and link back to the original work. So this Creative Commons site also has a way to search for images, and you can specify the type of license, whether you want to be able to modify it, whether you want to use it for commercial purposes or not, and you can search and locate images that way. And these all will be specifically licensed in some form. And if you pull it up in here, then and it meets your criteria, then you will be able to use that image without danger of copyright infringement. So those are some really useful tools, locating images. You'll see I did mention here that this image itself had been released to the public domain by the creator. So this is under what's called the CC0 license, which is essentially releasing it to the public domain. That is the original creator or rights holder has given up all their rights and released it out into the world to live free and multiply as however we wish. So if you're looking for images, those are two very useful resources. If you're looking to use copyrighted work, I encourage you to visit the library's copyright guide. We do have a little guide page on the library website under guides specifically for copyright. That includes a number of things, including this sort of roadmap, I like to call it, for copyright compliance. This is just a step-by-step analysis that kind of gives you, if you can find it under our blanket copyright license, then you're good to go. You don't have to go any further. If you can link out to it, then do that. If you can link to it in the library, you can do that. And then at the very bottom, we'll get to where we might actually have to contact the publisher and work to negotiate some sort of license. But I'll look at that one a little bit more closely before we're finished. And of course, you can always contact me or Deborah Zimick, who is our legal counsel, if it really requires some sort of legal decision or licensing to the university. That would need to go through her. But the library copyright page includes a lot of useful information. It does include some descriptions, some instructional materials on how to use the blanket copyright license. The blanket copyright license does require you to create an account associated with the university in order to log in and search the database. But I'll demonstrate that here. Okay, so from the library homepage, if you want to get to the guides, you can just go guides and A to Z, and then you'll get an alphabetical listing of all the guides that we put together. And under copyright, there's a number of resources. There's a basic, little quick overview, and then resources for students and faculty. Under the for employees, you'll see this video which tells you how to create an account and access the blanket copyright license. I'm going to walk you through just a quick demonstration of what that might look like. So once you've got your account created, and this will walk you through how to do that at the annual copyright license link here, you'll end up there we go. You'll end up in a sign-in page once you've created your account. And once you've logged in, oh, thank goodness, downtime notification, but not right now. Once you've logged in, you're taken to a bit of a search page here, and you can search for a textbook title or journal title, go to physical distribution. So this is one of the textbooks we use in the PT department, and I can search that title. I can search by ISBN, which I encourage you to do because there are often multiple editions of various publications in here. So make sure that the rights that you're checking under the blanket license are for the edition that you're interested in. But once you locate the book that you're looking for, you can see whether or not this is covered under the license or not. So you'll either get an image like this that shows these things are not allowed, or you'll get an image like this that shows that they are. And you can click in and get a closer look at what is allowed. So this says our institution has obtained rights for this. So this is something that we pay a fairly substantial fee per year, but it gives us license to use a large number of works in sort of blanket permission. So as long as it's listed in here and has the rights indicated, then we've already licensed that work. So if you can find it in here, you're good to go. There are some terms. They say this is the license that says limits to 10% of the work. You can use it in a course pack. You can use it in electronic reserve, all those common uses that we typically find in a digital environment. The one thing to be aware of in terms of the blanket copyright license is that images are not covered unless they're included as part of a text. So what that means is you can share a chapter of a covered textbook, and if the images are in that chapter, then you're fine. What you can't do is pull an image out and stick that in your lecture, because the images in isolation are not licensed. They're only licensed as part of the text, if that makes sense. So this essentially covers text only and only covers images in as much as part of a chapter or an article or something like that. So do keep that in mind when you're checking the blanket license. If you find that confusing or difficult to navigate, you can always reach out to me or one of the other librarians, and we're happy to check on its coverage status for you. Just provide us with the information that we need as far as ISBNs and titles and things like that, and we'll get right back to you and tell you whether or not it's covered or not. Okay. So that's quite useful, and really does cover a great deal of material. So that should be your first step. If it's not covered in there, then maybe you can link out, like we talked about. If it's available as open access on the web, then you can link directly to the article at the publisher site. If it's not available as open access, you might link through the library. I'll do a demonstration here in just a second. But really, when it comes to accessing resources, linking, best practice for sharing those resources isn't to share the document, it's to link to it in some way. As I said before, that way you're not doing the distribution, you're just providing your student with a link to an authorized distributor. I think that's fairly clear. So linking when you can. I do want to do a quick demonstration of one of the simpler ways to access what we call permanent links. Get in the library page. So let's say we're looking at an article in management. If I can create these what we call permanent links for any article that's available through the university. It's really simplest within the EBSCO databases, or if you're using the SearchUSA tool to search our databases. If you can locate an article that's full text, or even an e-textbook potentially that's available as full text, then you can link to that article through the database. It's very simple to create the permanent link. What I mean by the permanent link, find something here. So here's an article available as full text in either form here. A lot of instructors are inclined to just copy the URL from their browser, and instinctually that makes perfect sense, but the problem is that this URL is dynamically created according to your login section. So really that URL is specific to your access under your username in this particular login section. So if you share that link, it may not function long. It might work for a little bit, or it might not work at all, but it's not a permanent link. If you want to share a permanent link, the easy way to do that is to, once you're on the item record here, you scroll down the side, you'll see an icon here that says permalink, and that's going to create what we call a permanent or persistent link. You'll see that appear at the top of the article record here. Now that you can copy and paste into your course shell, and it will be a permanent link that will bring them to this page. It will ask them to log in using their student information to access through our library resources, but that's the link that you want to share to get them there. Creating it through SearchUSA or through any of the EBSCO databases using that permalink tool is certainly the simplest way to go. Some of the other items that we have, creating those is a little bit difficult. But if you want to email us and ask for a custom link to an item, we'd be happy to provide that for you. I do just want to distinguish between the dynamic session-related URL that is not permanent, is not durable long-term, and the creation of an actual permanent or persistent link. And that persistent one is the one that you would want to share. So that's pretty easy, at least within the SearchUSA for creating and linking out to resources. So if you're able to do that, then you don't even have to worry about sharing the work. Then that's another quick win. You're not going to step into any violation if you share a link to a resource. Another tool I want to point out is the fair use evaluation. This is something that was put out by the University of Minnesota, which is an incredibly useful tool that sort of walks you through some checklists for thinking about fair use, basically looking at those 4 factors we discussed, but kind of putting it in very practical terms. So just link directly to it. Yes. So if I go to this again is linked through the library's page here on the copyright guide on the introductory tab. It's this thinking through fair use. So let me get there. So what this is this is at the University of Minnesota Libraries. There's some description to understanding the 4 factors and what that looks like, kind of the same conversation that we just had. But then there's this tool for thinking it through. And you can go through for each of the factors and sort of treat it like a little checklist. I'm using it for educational use, it's commercial, not transformative, not profiting. So how does that play out according to our checklists? Maybe somewhat favoring the nature of the copyrighted work. It's published. It's factual. Okay, maybe weighs in favor. So you can go through and get a sort of very practical, very specific analysis of where that falls in a look at those 4 factors. Now, interestingly, simply by virtue of going through that analysis, you're protecting yourself and the university to some extent. So if you can document that and preserve it anytime that you do consider using something for fair use, if it were to come to litigation, the fact that we had done due diligence, the fact that we had tried to evaluate that, would protect us in many ways against damages if there were copyright infringement found. So doing that due diligence, not only does it give you a perspective on whether or not that use would be protected under copy, whether it would fall under those exclusionary uses that were allowed. Gives you, if not crystal clear, it definitely assists you in making that call. And that's very useful. And just found through the library's copyright guide. So quick review on the images. Look to those instructor resources if they're available. That's a useful workaround to having quality images to incorporate into your work. Use the RightFind Academic. That's our blanket copyright license. If it's covered in there, the images are only covered if they're a part of the text. You can't extract the image in isolation, even if it's covered under the RightFind license. Inform yourself a little bit about Creative Commons. Look to Google Images and those tools for sifting through the images that are out there. Verify that the permissions are in place for you to use that. But it's very often, I think you can find at least a reasonable substitute, if not some really good material, even within permissive use that's specifically licensed, whether that's a Creative Commons license or just a public domain release that you might locate through Google Images. So that's useful information to keep in mind. I wanted to create a specific scenario regarding assessments, particularly some of the OT tools and assessments that are available. Unfortunately, that's a very tricky area. I would love to have created a scenario that showed how that could look and fall under the uses that we have in mind. But because it's so protected and so fraught with the potential for violation, I kind of shied away from it. But I did want to address it because it's a very common issue. Typically, those manuals, those instrument forms, checklists for evaluations and assessments are copyrighted. So the forms themselves are copyrighted. The manuals are copyrighted. They're meant to be, the forms themselves are meant to be consumable, meaning, you buy a package of 50 and you use them for your patients. You work through them. Now, there's certainly a possible scenario where you want to teach the use of that tool to your students, you want to demonstrate it and maybe even have them fill some out. But copying those forms and distributing them to your students really is a treacherous territory. So how you use those is going to be pretty tightly constrained, unfortunately. We're looking at possible solutions, particularly during this crisis period for our online instruction. But those copyright assertions really make that difficult. When it comes to the manuals, a small number of those types of assessments are included under the RightFind license. So maybe you might be able to do a key chapter or some text from the licensed material that we have. But more often than not, if those things are going to make their way into the online environment, we need to be very careful about how we do it. And I'm happy to make myself available. I think getting in touch with the publisher and maybe getting some sort of extraordinary circumstance permission from the publisher in that regard might be the way that we need to go. But if you have an instrument, an assessment manual or tool that you'd like to use, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll try to work with you, the publisher, and your program director to secure some licensing if we need to. Those forms and manuals, again, are very strictly copyrighted, so reproducing them and distributing them would be problematic. That being said, I want to be able to say yes to this as much as possible, particularly in the current circumstances. So we will look into that as much as we need to. So if you have an instrument that you'd like to include, please reach out to me. Hopefully, I can manage to get in contact with the publisher and negotiate some sort of permission. Just to point you back to that copyright guide, just a close-up version of it in here. So that's the Are You Being Copyright Compliant on the faculty page. So if we zoom in on that, first step, is it covered under the academic license? If so, then you're fine. You can use that text. If it's open access, try linking out to it on the web. If it's available through the library, you can either create a permalink using the EBSCO databases or contact a librarian and we'll get you a customized link for you to share in your course shell rather than sharing the document itself. If it's a campus-based course, we might be able to put a print copy on reserve. That's certainly not going to be the case under the current circumstances, but that's an option if you're on campus. If you're not, and none of those other solutions really work for you, and as is the case with the assessments and instruments, we might need to negotiate a purchase license from the publisher in order to be able to utilize that. I'm hoping that the publishers will work with us. A number of publishers have been, in the current crisis, been very friendly about online sharing of materials, but they're typically controlling it. So there might be some room for negotiation there, and I'd be happy to work with them who needed that. So if anybody has any questions, certainly open. If not, I would like to point you to this. I can put it in the chat, but I will also send out a link to this feedback poll. This takes just a few seconds for you to give us some feedback on these webinars, how useful they were, that kind of thing, what you'd like to see in the future so that we can try to tailor these to be as useful as possible and to cover material that would be useful to you. That's all. If anybody has any questions, certainly open to that. If not, I'll say goodbye. Thank you very much. Please consider linking out and linking to the feedback poll when you get it and giving me that feedback. All right, thank you very much.